I just want to say that I've been working in the last year to get all of these books changed over into open access. And just today, I got word from the nice people at Oxford University Press that two more are now open access. So go to if you're interested, go to my website and you can just click and get the PDF for almost all of these books now. Not quite every one, but very nice. Not inexpensive, but the right thing to do, at least in my situation, I think. So this project that I'm going to talk about is Inequality, the Problem, which is my tentative title, is now a book manuscript. And I'm gonna, because it's a book, I'm gonna inevitably skip over parts, really large chunks in the 45 or so minutes I have. If you're interested and want to read more, just send me an email. I'll send you the manuscript and you can have at it. And I'm very much looking forward to all kinds of feedback, especially critical, skeptical feedback, because it's not done. So I've got opportunity to make changes, small and large. It's a longstanding project of mine. I've studied inequality for 25 or so years, and used to be pretty convinced that income inequality was, if not the problem, very close to it. I started working on comparative analysis, I think around 2008, 2009, 2010. Then it tentatively became a joint project with an American sociologist, Christopher Jenks, who had, unbeknownst to me at the time, was working on something very similar. So we tossed around ideas and started working on a project. And then after a couple of conferences and more thinking, and I think most especially because there was a lot of empirical work coming out at the time, we just felt like it wasn't the right time to try to do some sort of stock taking on this question, which is really what I'm trying to do here. So we abandoned it. I then thought of doing it by myself anyway, but then gave that up, set it aside, and now I've come back to it really about 10 years after giving it up. I don't know if this is the right time to do this, but anyway, here's what I have. Okay, so just to be clear, to start, the inequality that I'm focusing on here is the kind of overall inequality in the society. It's not inequality between specific groups, males, females, different ethnicities, native-born immigrants, that sort of thing. This is a sort of Gini coefficient and top 1% share type of inequality measuring across the society as a whole. Yeah. Okay, good. I have for a long time thought and still believe that there's a very strong normative ethical argument for reducing income inequality, especially in my own country, the United States, where it's the highest and has increased the most, as best we can tell, in this last 40 years or so of rising income inequality. Most of what determines where any particular person ends up in the wage or income distribution is due to stuff beyond their control. That in and of itself is a good reason. And that used to be the core reason why those who favored inequality reduction as a policy strategy did so. But now I think, or at least my reading of the discussion, academic, journalistic, punditry, and among policymakers, is that this has shifted. And the core argument now is seen as being that income inequality has harmful effects on other things that we want to achieve. I'm going to focus here on 5 of them. They're not the only ones, but I think they're my take is that they're the dominant ones in the discussion in the literature. And they're really important. So living standards, democracy, opportunity, specifically equality of opportunity, longevity, that's the poor measure of health that people have tended to look at. Some of this discussion broadens into other measures of health, and then happiness or subjective well-being. Okay. So I do think the case for inequality reduction as a policy strategy, and I should also say that this is the thing that I'm most interested in, is what are the policy implications of this question, of this hypothesis, of this set of empirical analyses. I do think it's much stronger if this hypothesis that income inequality has harmful consequences is correct. And so the core of what I'm doing in this book is trying to see whether we should conclude that it's correct or not, and if so, how strong is the effect? One of the things that I want to suggest is that we need to focus on countries. That's not the only unit that people have explored or should explore, can explore when assessing this income inequality as harmful effect. But I don't think that we can ignore the evidence from countries for two reasons. Most of the time, what people mean when they say income inequality has harmful effects is that if a certain country has more income inequality than others, it's going to have worse outcomes in democracy or living standards, happiness or whatever. Or if income inequality goes up in that country, that these outcomes are going to worsen. One or more of these outcomes is going to worsen. And the only way to really test that is to look at countries. There are real limits to our ability to draw inferences from a relatively small set of rich democratic nations in a fairly short period of time. But I don't think we can ignore this evidence. The other thing is that the chief levers for affecting income inequality are at the level of the national government. And so there too, we ought to be studying countries. So I don't want to say that people shouldn't be analyzing individuals or subnational units or neighborhoods or organizations, simply that we need to take into account the evidence that comes from countries, the conclusions that we can glean from looking at countries. So I'm going to look at a set of longstanding democratic rich nations, starting around 1979, when income inequality begins to rise in a number of these countries and going up through the previous business cycle peak and right before COVID in 2019. We've got good data, reliable, comparable data for most of these countries for most of these years. I also want to say, although I have to talk more about this, but I don't want to get into it here, that there's good reason to think that causal patterns will be different in these countries than they will in lower or middle income countries. I'll just give you one quick example. There's a fairly robust set of findings now that income inequality tends to reduce economic growth in poor countries, but the main pathways through which this occur are political instability and then education. So lots of parents keep their kids out of school because they need them to help them agricultural work or to supplement the household income. Neither of these things happens to any appreciable extent in the rich, long-standing democratic countries. And so there's no reason to necessarily think that what we find in one set of countries will hold for another. Okay. We have two main measures of income inequality for countries. One comes from mainly income tax records, and it's a measure that separates those at the very top, the top 1% usually, although it doesn't have to be, from the bottom 99%. We've got estimates here going back for some countries to the late 1800s. This is the pattern over time. So I'll just say it, in most of these countries, income inequality seems to have been decreasing for a long time, starting around 1910, 20, 30, depending on the country, reaches a low point around 1979, 80, early 1980s, and then begins to rise again. Not in all countries, and importantly, to differing degrees. But so that's the pattern. The second measure of inequality usually is a Gini coefficient, although it doesn't have to be. This, for the most part, gives us information on inequality within the rest of society, because these data come from surveys. Typically, we don't have enough very affluent, so top 1%ers. So usually we top code the data. That means we're dropping those at the very top of the distribution, top 1 or 2 or 3%. And so this is essentially telling us about what's going on in the rest of the society. These data are better for this purpose. The income tax record data are better for separating the 1% from everyone else. They're not as good for telling us about inequality within the bottom 99%. Ideally, maybe we'd be able to merge these two data sources and get a single overall measure. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office, a government agency, has been doing this for a long time. But efforts are really only now being started to do this in many other countries. We do have some preliminary efforts to do it. But two problems here. One is that this relies so far on a fair amount of imputation and estimation, maybe even guesstimation. And it's so new that I don't think we have a very good idea how trustworthy, how reliable, how comparable these data are. The other thing is, it turns out that when you look at patterns across countries and over time, these two measures, which again are focusing on inequality at different points in the distribution, one separates those at the top from everyone else, one tells us about inequality within the rest. They tell a different story, or they can tell a different story. So here, these are average levels of inequality using the two measures. So on the horizontal axis is the bottom 99% Gini coefficient. On the vertical axis is the top 1% income share, which separates the 1% from everyone else. There's a positive correlation between the two. They tell a fairly similar story for a lot of countries, but not for all of them. Some of the countries differ pretty considerably. And so if you're comparing Denmark and Portugal, for example, I'll reach over. I have to fight my urge to walk around because normally I walk all over the place, but since I'm on camera here, I'm going to try to stay put. Anyway, it matters a lot which of the two measures you choose. And when we look at change over this period from 79 to 2019, it matters even more. There's, again, still, roughly a positive correlation between the two measures, but there's a lot of difference depending on which measure you choose. So I think the smartest, most prudent course of action, at least right now, is to look at both of these measures to see if they tell us similar or different stories. I'm going to privilege or prioritize analyses that focus on variation across the countries in change over time rather than in levels, for a very well-known standard reason, which is that when we're comparing levels across countries, it's really easy to mistake what looks like an effect of income inequality or whatever measure or variable or indicator we care about for what really is some other difficult to measure factor that varies across the countries, maybe culture or something else. When we examine cross-country differences in change over time, we take at least unchanging differences across the countries that might be correlated with inequality out of play. It's not a perfect strategy, but it's preferable. And it's particularly useful when the data have three features. So one is that there's significant overtime change in the hypothesized cause. That, as you saw from the times charts that I showed you earlier, is the case with income inequality since 1979. There's been a fair amount of change, not in all countries, but in many of them. Second, when there's variation across the units in that change. And third, when the change is mostly in the same direction rather than just sort of bouncing up and down. And so all three of these conditions apply here. So it's a useful approach for multiple reasons. In any case, I'm going to show you patterns for levels of inequality and levels of the outcomes, but I'm going to, again, as I said, privilege the change analyses. And I'll throw in some controls for a few things here and there. There's a limit to what you can do with, again, 20-ish or so units, 20 countries. I'm not going to make a big deal of this except where it matters. So let me start. And what I think I'm going to do. So I've written out done the analyses, some of which are my own analyses, some of which is trying to synthesize what other people have found for each of these 5 outcomes. But I'm just going to show you, I think, probably 2 of them, and then I can come back to others if you're interested. They're pretty representative of what I find for the other 3. But I want to tell you some additional things that I've done here, at least to whet your appetite. If not to, I may not be able to convince you. So I'm going to look at 4 indicators of living standards: economic growth, low-end incomes, middle-class incomes, that's the median, 50th percentile, and household balance sheets. That's just net saving. For each of these, there are, I think, very plausible hypotheses about why income inequality might lead to worse outcomes. That might slow economic growth. It might reduce either levels or increases in incomes at the bottom of the distribution. Often we use the 10th percentile because data quality get a little dicey when you go much below that. levels or increases in middle-class incomes and household saving. And I'll just say really quickly, in case you're unfamiliar with this, the main arguments about household balance sheets are that if one of the hypothesized pathways or channels runs through income growth, so the idea here is that if income inequality is going up a lot or it's at a very high level, people in the middle class and maybe also below have less income than they otherwise would. So to get the stuff that they want to consume, they have to borrow more. And then there's a second argument about especially housing being a positional good. This is often associated with an American economist, Robert Frank, who's, I think, spelled this out extensively and pretty clearly over the last couple of decades. And the idea here is that as the rich and maybe the upper middle class have seen their incomes balloon, in part due, maybe in large part due to rising income inequality, they've spent more money on bigger houses, refurbished their houses. People in the kind of lower upper middle class look around and they say, oh my gosh, I've got to keep up with the Joneses. But they don't have the rising incomes or the very high incomes that the rich or the super rich do. So they borrow more in order to expand their kitchen or add more square feet or move to a nicer neighborhood or whatever. And then this trickles down or ripples down through the income distribution. Okay, so very plausible hypotheses. What do we see in the data? So for economic growth, have countries with higher levels of income inequality tended to have slower economic growth. As I said before, among poor and probably middle income countries, the answer here is yes, but among the rich countries, as I'll show you, the answer is no. Have countries with larger increases in income inequality tended to have larger decreases in economic growth. In many of these countries, economic growth has been slower in the 2000s and 2010s than it was in the 80s and 90s. In the period as a whole, it's been slower than those three glorious decades, as we sometimes call them after World War II. But anyway, there has been a slowdown in most of these countries. So we would expect, if the hypothesis is right, that where income inequality has gone up more, there's been a larger slowdown, but that hasn't happened. So I'm going to show you really simple graphical depictions of these patterns across countries in levels and changes. Happy to talk about the details if you want, but I'm not going to belabor them now. This is the picture in levels, no association between the two. When I show you these kind of graphs, I'm always going to show you two. They differ only in the measure of income inequality. On the left is the top 1% share measure. On the right is the bottom 99% Gini measure. So the vertical axis is going to be the same in each of the two graphs. And then I'll show you one pair of graphs for levels and one for changes. And with the changes, again, we're looking at cross-country variation in changes. Okay, so the hypothesis here is that we'll see a downward sloping line. Higher levels of income inequality would be slower, associated with slower economic growth, lower economic growth. And we don't see that. Same is true with the change story. So this is changes in income inequality over this period, 79 to 2019 on the horizontal axes, and changes in economic growth over this period, this 40-year or so period. And by the way, I think I skipped over this, but especially when mainly when we're looking at changes, there's a real possibility that income inequality, if it does have harmful effects, or, in an alternative hypothesis, could have beneficial effects. That was a very common hypothesis back a generation ago, far less common now. But anyway, it might take quite a while to do so. And I think it's quite reasonable to say, well, is 40 years enough? This too was part of the reason why I sort of abandoned this a decade or so ago. At that point, I was looking at 1979 to 2007, right up, business cycle peak to business cycle peak, but right before the economic crash. And that was just a little more than 2 decades, about 2.5 decades. And, it was very reasonable to say, well, if income inequality is going to slow economic growth or reduce household incomes or whatever, it might take much longer than 2.5 decades. Might take longer than 4 decades. I don't know for sure, but this seems to me a fairly long period of time to allow income inequality to have whatever harmful effects or consequences it's going to have. Okay, so nothing we can see when it comes to economic growth. What about low-end incomes? And I use the 10th percentile, which is fairly common in the literature here. Very reasonable to suspect that higher levels or faster growth in income inequality would reduce levels or growth of low-end incomes. We do see that pattern in levels, but it's easy to imagine some other things that are associated with income inequality, like unionization or family patterns, employment levels, that might be the real cause of the association we see. And when we look at the, I think, more informative change patterns, we don't see the association. So the chart on the right is consistent with the hypothesis. We see a negative slope here. So higher level of income inequality is associated with lower levels. These are absolute, by the way, not relative. So there's not a relative poverty measure. It's just absolute levels of income at the 10th percentile of households. And it's a fairly strong negative correlation, but again, could be due to other things. And when we look at changes over time, we just don't see any indication of a pattern here. My interpretation of why this was puzzling to me, I wrote an article about 10 years ago on this. And the conclusion I came up with is that when we're looking at the low end of the distribution, roughly speaking, the bottom 20% or so, a lot of income gains now in the rich democratic countries now come from government transfers. A fair number of people are retired, disabled, unemployed, sick at any given point in time. And so a lot of what's driving this is not wage patterns, which could be strongly affected by income inequality, but instead government decisions about whether or not and to what degree to increase government transfers. And these things seem to have been uncorrelated with patterns of income growth. And so one way to see that, I think, is to compare. This used to be stronger prior to this decade, the divergence. So the US and the UK are among the countries with the biggest increase in income inequality, but very different choices about government transfers to those with low incomes, at least in parts of this period. So 1997 to 2010 in the UK, we see really non-trivial increases in a variety of transfers to low-income people, despite, at the same time, a significant rise in income inequality. Didn't happen to nearly the same degree in the United States. Okay, anyway, middle-class incomes, I want to be mindful of the time here. Middle-class incomes, we just don't see any association. Here, this is the levels charts. We actually see the opposite of the predicted correlation. It's a little bit positive, but it's not, it's very weak, and there's really nothing to see there. And we look at changes over time, again, essentially flat lines in terms of the association between income inequality and middle-class incomes. Now, maybe 7 or 8 years ago for a volume that Brian Nolan edited, I wrote a paper on the United States about this exact question, just focusing on the American case and trying to really dig into the guts of the data. And I concluded that the rise in income inequality had in fact reduced middle-class incomes in the United States. That may still be true. One of the things that I try to do in this manuscript, and hopefully it'll come out here, especially when I move to the next thing and talk about democracy, is that the United States is in many ways a special case. It's certainly an extreme case. Whether it's an informative case is an interesting question, but worth exploring. And in some circumstances, both because it's extreme, but also because of data availability, it makes a lot of sense to really look carefully at the US case. When I say it could be an informative as an extreme case, one of the possibilities here is that we have nonlinear effects. That is to say that income inequality doesn't really have much in the way of harmful consequences until you reach a certain level, or until it increases at a certain rate or a certain pace. And again, the United States has the highest level and also the fastest increase over this period of all these rich democratic countries. So it might be informative in that respect. But anyway, we don't see the pattern for middle class incomes, and I'll just quickly give you the story for household balance sheets. It also, and this surprised me for a long time. I found this, especially Robert Frank's story about the housing being a positional good. This seemed really compelling to me. But when we look at net household saving, just don't really see any correlation. And here I'll just tell you, I thought, well, it's got to be true in the American case, though. It's just got to be true that Americans have been borrowing more and more and more and running up more and more indebtedness in response to the high level and the extreme rise in income inequality, and the fact that we're so compelled by status and keeping up with the Joneses, and our rich are so visible and so prominent. But when I don't have this here, but it's in the book draft. When you look at household debt payments as a share of income, it's barely budged since 1980. Really weirdly. I mean, it, goes up a little bit after 2008, 2009, but it's come back down in the last decade. Now, part of that is a story of low interest rates. But really you'd expect I expected a much larger effect on household spending and therefore indebtedness, spending, borrowing, and therefore indebtedness from the high level and the rise in income inequality. Okay, so that's living standards. For living standards, I've done a fair number of very kind of primitive, simple quantitative analyses. I do something very similar for health and for happiness, but I'm not going to talk about this here because otherwise I'll run out of time. For democracy and also for equality of opportunity, because we don't have the same kind of data for all these 21 countries for most or all of these years from 1979 to 2019 for the relevant outcome measure or measures. Instead, what I do is look very closely at the United States, and I try to think through, okay, so if the inequality is harmful or income inequality is harmful hypothesis is correct, what sorts of things would we expect to observe in the American case? And I do a little bit of comparative analysis because we have a little bit of data that can be informative. But the key outcome here, I think, is equality of political influence. And while lots of political sociologists and political scientists and some other social scientists too have done all kinds of great social science looking into this, we actually have stunningly little systematic over time hard, careful look at data. The best analysis of this type so far was done by Martin Gilens, an American political scientist with a team of graduate students. Let me step back for just a second. One way to think about democracy, so I'm not looking here at the question of is democracy going to disappear or be under serious threat? And I say this, what are we, 6 months out now from an election in my own country where this question is literally on the ballot, but that's not what most of the literature on this has focused on, and it's not what I'm focusing on here. Instead, it's the understanding of democracy as equality of opportunity for political influence or to influence policy outcomes. So we don't expect every individual to actually have the same amount of influence. A lot of people don't even vote, for example. But we want people to have the same opportunity to exert influence on policy choices, on policy outcomes. How do we tell if they do or we don't? Well, we can't directly measure opportunity, just like we can't when it comes to economic things. So we look at estimates of influence, and then we infer opportunity from that. This is problematic, but it's the best we can do in social science. So how do we measure influence? Well, what Martin Gilens, and he was following a study by Larry Bartels and a few other political scientists had done something kind of like this before. What he did was he went back and looked at public opinion surveys on a wide range of issues. Public opinion surveys almost always ask a question about people's income. There are only 1,000 or 2,000 people here in the United States in these surveys, so you can't measure the top 1%. The best Gilens decided, again, following Larry Bartels and some others, that we can do is probably just divide the income distribution up into thirds. So we'll call it high income, middle income, low income. He looked to see issues where opinion among people at different income levels differed on particular issues. And this is a whole range of potential policy outcomes. And then looked at actual policy changes or non-changes over the next 5 years to see whether they correlated more with expressed preferences, expressed views of those with high incomes or middle incomes or low incomes. And Gillen's finding was that, well, first of all, in many issues, there's actually surprising amount of agreement, but when there's disagreement among people at different income levels, American policy changes tend to correlate much more strongly with the expressed views of high income Americans. There's very little difference between the middle and the low. They exert, as best we can tell, very little influence on policy when they disagree with people with higher incomes. So that's the kind of measure that we need. In the last 5 years or so, we've begun to get similar analyses like this for a handful of countries, but we don't really have any kind of comparable database that would allow us to say, well, the correlation with high income or the disjuncture in influence, the inequality of influence between those with high incomes and the rest is stronger in the United States than it is in Sweden or the UK or whatever country. There's one study along these lines that I know of. It was done by Larry Bartels, but it only looked at social policy. So it's quite limited. I'll mention that in just a few moments. So anyway, we don't have the kind of cross-country comparative data, and certainly not that also covers this entire period that we would like to do any kind of quantitative analysis. So I'm just going to ask some questions and see what as best I can tell, again, drawing on others and to some degree on my own work, the answers are and how they speak to the inequality is harmful hypothesis. So the first question is, do higher income, and I'm going to focus on the United States because that's where we have a lot of data and more of this type of analysis. Do higher income Americans have more influence on policy decisions than those with middle or lower incomes? I just said the answer seems to be yes from Gillen's study, also Bartel's study, and there are a few others now that have reached the same conclusion. But interestingly, so Gillen's his analysis doesn't cover the entire period. He went all the way back to the early 60s, then to the 80s and 90s, and then the early part of the 2000s. So he didn't include the latter part of the 2000s or any of the 2010s. But for the years that he did cover, it doesn't look like there's been any increase in the inequality of political influence by income that he observes for the period as a whole. So we would expect if income inequality gives higher income Americans more leverage, that as the gap in income between higher income Americans and the rest has grown, and it's grown a lot during this period since 1979, we'd expect the gap in influence to have increased. And as best we can tell, it hasn't. Now, again, Gillen's analysis only covers a subset of the relevant years. Could well be that when somebody comes along and does the full analysis that covers all these years, they'll find, yeah, it actually has gone up. But the data we have right now suggests that it hasn't, contrary to what the hypothesis predicts. Is the gap larger, the gap in political influence between the rich and the rest, larger in the United States than in nations with less economic inequality? Again, only one study allows us to try to answer this question. It was done by Bartels. It's in a working paper that is, to my knowledge, is as yet unpublished. But the answer he concludes or draws seems to be no. And there's also not that much difference across countries he relies mostly on Western European nations. Have the kinds of outcomes that the rich, especially in the United States, want from policy, have they changed in accordance with the expressed preferences of the rich during this period of rising inequality? Or have they changed more in the United States than in countries with less income inequality? I think the answer to both of those things is no. Top-end tax rates have gone down in the United States, but they've gone down in most countries. Financial regulation has decreased. Same is true in most countries. Unionization has decreased. Also true in almost all of the rich democratic countries, except the 5 Ghent nations. Furthermore, interestingly, in the U.S., the first 2 of these outcomes changed most substantially right at the beginning of the period of rising income inequality in the early to mid 1980s, not toward the end, when presumably the rich, because of rising inequality, would have had even more comparative influence. Do Republicans, our more conservative party whose views on at least economic or financial issues align more with the preferences of the rich, do they get more campaign money than Democrats and win more elections? Not in this recent period. You may already know this, but the Democratic presidential candidate has gotten a majority of the popular vote, or the most popular votes in 7 of the last 8 American presidential elections. We have this weird electoral college, so 2 of those times that Democratic candidate didn't become the president. But it's also the case that Democrats have kept up. And in fact, in 2020, they had way more campaign contributions than Republicans did. If we look within the United States and compare across states, we have measures of income inequality and some measures of this disjuncture or inequality in political influence. But it doesn't seem to correspond with inequality across states. The American states with the most income inequality are states like California, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, states that are, at least in our framework or in our political climate, the furthest to the left of the spectrum, not the furthest to the right. And then I'm going to skip over that. It's a complicated story. So my conclusion here, when it comes to democracy is, again, first of all, we don't have the data that we would really want to do the kind of analysis I would like to do, or I would like somebody to do, to really answer this question, drawing on patterns, levels, and changes across countries. So focusing on the United States, where we have the best data, and again, where we would expect the effects maybe to be strongest because we have the highest level and the biggest increase in income inequality. It is the case that the rich seem to have more influence over policy decisions, policy outcomes than those in the middle or lower parts of the income distribution. But in here, we get to what I think is the relevant policy question, which is that none of the evidence we have, I think, suggests that if the United States were to somehow magically be able to return our top 1% share or Gini coefficient back to its level in 1979, when it was at its, as best we can tell, its all-time low, that this would do anything to reduce the inequality of influence on policy decisions. Maybe it would, but that's purely speculation at this point. We really don't have any evidence, I think, to support a conclusion that it would. Okay, so as I said, I'm already close to using up all my time, so I'm going to skip over. Okay, well, I still want to go to the end. It's not really the end. It's more like the middle, which is why I want to skip over now. But I'm happy to come back. And again, I'll send you, if you're really interested, I'll send you the book manuscript. So just let me know. Okay. So my interest again is in policy implications. So I want to ask a few more questions. The core of what I do here is try to assess this income inequality is harmful hypothesis. But I want to look at some more stuff. I'm going to be very quick here. Do people want less inequality? So I think the public opinion data across these countries throughout this period of time, to some degree, they're patchy. The questions aren't perfect, but I think by now we can pretty safely draw a conclusion that in most cases they suggest that people would prefer less income inequality to more, and they support government efforts to do something about this, to reduce inequality. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that we don't have evidence to suggest that people care very strongly about this, that this is an issue at the forefront of their minds or at the top of their list of concerns. So one example here is a lot of times public opinion surveys will ask people an open-ended question saying, what are the most important problems facing the country? Even in the United States, where this question has been asked all the time, going back to the 1930s, hardly anybody ever says income inequality. Even when they're asked to or allowed to give, 3, 4, 5 concerns rather than just one. Usually the pollster asks for just one. Okay, so that's relevant. Another thing that's relevant here is that we now have some efforts to try to measure income inequality all across the globe. Most measures of income inequality are within a single country, and almost all analyses of income inequality up until fairly recently have been of inequality within country. A level at a point in time, a change within countries, a comparison across countries. We don't have the real data that would allow us to get a fairly reliable measure of worldwide income inequality that is taking into account all 8 billion of us, as opposed to 330 million Americans or 5 million Danes or whatever. So researchers that are working on this are trying to combine information from GDP per capita, which is often the only information we have for a poor country. We don't have direct measures of income inequality, but you can guesstimate what that tells you about inequality, and then actual measures of inequality for the rich democratic countries, and now maybe, I don't know, 30 or 40 others where we've got some reliable data on income inequality. This is an estimate or a set of estimates from Branko Milanovic, who has been working on this for about 2 decades, and I think is probably the most trustworthy here, although it may turn out that this is entirely wrong. But for what it's worth, His estimate is that income inequality has dropped a lot in the last 20 years. Much of that is because of rising incomes, average incomes in a bunch of poor countries around the world, in particular China and more recently India. There's other stuff going on as well, but that's a big part of the driver. This is, I think, potentially relevant for, again, policy implications. I'll come back to it. I'm interested in wealth. We have far less data on wealth, so there's far less I think we can do, but I want to make two observations here that I think are relevant. So, let me just skip over. These are data from Thomas Piketty's book from a decade ago on 4 countries for which, he's got long-term estimates. But I want to just go to the OECD data, which only go back to about 2008, 2010 for most of these countries, and just point you to one thing here, which is that the Nordic countries, which I think, and this draws on some other work I've done and lots of other people have done, these are, I think, the countries that have gotten it as close to right in terms of the sorts of policies and institutions that get us good outcomes that we care about. They're also among the countries with the highest levels of wealth inequality. The variation is not large. They all have a lot less than my country, the United States, which again is an outlier here. But Denmark and Sweden are right up here. The Netherlands is also a pretty good society or close to it. Here's Norway. Finland's the only one that's down lower in the ranking. So that's one point. A second, this is to my knowledge, the one country for which we have maybe kind of sort of trustworthy, really long-term data. So this is an estimate of the wealth share of the bottom 50% of households in France, going back 2 centuries. It's low and it's constant. Varies between maybe 2 and 5% over this period. If we think wealth inequality as a real driver of living standards and well-being, I think what we ought to expect is pretty limited improvement in living standards and well-being of the bottom 50% of the French population over the last 2 decades. But that's not at all what we observed in almost every indicator for which we have any kind of data: economic security, opportunity, income, health, education, housing, free time, lots of other things. These things have improved massively. Doesn't mean that wealth inequality doesn't matter, but I do think this is relevant to keep in mind, especially given that we have such limited data on wealth inequality from which to draw any sort of harder conclusions. Okay, so here's the punchline that I've reached at this point. I think we ought to try to reduce income inequality, wealth inequality, especially in my own country where it's so high and it's been increasing a lot. But I don't think this should be a primary goal. I think it should be a secondary goal. Okay, let me elaborate a bit. From what I glean from other people's studies and what I can figure out from or think I figured out from the kinds of analyses that I've done, I don't think we should presume that we're going to be able to achieve other valuable goals like improving longevity, improving living standards, increasing economic growth, I shouldn't say safeguarding, improving democracy, or at least preventing democracy, preventing inequality of political influence from getting worse, increasing happiness or improving life satisfaction. I don't think that we're going to make a lot of progress, or we should presume we can make a lot of progress on these things by reducing income inequality. I think we should probably try to attack them directly rather than indirectly. I think given that, and given other things that I believe we know about the experience of the rich democratic countries, our core priority ought to continue to be raising the floor, bringing up living standards at the bottom. And this includes expanding and improving lots of public goods and services that don't show up in measures of income inequality. And that sometimes, researchers who study inequality know that, well, we can try to estimate how much a particular service would be worth and how much that might change income inequality, or a measure of relative poverty, which is roughly inequality in the bottom half of the distribution. But most people just don't think about this. And in fact, if the United States were to tomorrow provide health insurance to the 9 or 10% of Americans that don't currently have it, this would not show up in our Gini coefficient in our top 1% share, at least not in most of them. Actually, the Congressional Budget Office would try to include it in a way that I don't think is very good. Anyway, the point is, these things are worth doing. And I think arguably, and this comes back to that point I made about the Nordic countries and wealth inequality, where the floor is high and life is pretty secure and stable and at a reasonably high level of well-being for most, if not all, the population. It's just not clear that inequality is likely to matter all that much. This comes back to the point I was just making. We should recognize that public services and goods reduce inequality of lived experience, even if they don't reduce the top 1% share or the Gini coefficient. I want to say, again, I said this just a minute or a minute and a half ago, I'm in favor of reducing inequality, but it's mainly because of the normative or ethical argument that's been there for a long time. I'm, roughly speaking, Rawlsian about these things. And I think John Rawls 50 years ago now, or a little more than 50 years ago, put it well enough in making a very careful argument about why we should care about inequality. Also other things too. But because fairness matters and much of income inequality and wealth inequality is unfair, and because reducing them has non-trivial public support, I'm in favor of doing this. But where there's a choice between making people's lives better and doing something that will reduce income inequality, I think we should opt for the former. Okay, let me give you a couple of elaborations here and then I'll close. In the United States and many other places, the sort of standard indicators that you see all over the place usually are GDP growth, unemployment rate in the last year or two, inflation rate, back in the 70s, inflation rate in between, not so much unless you go to meetings of the central bank, and the stock market. We ought to have more headline indicators that ought to be all over the media. But I can think of at least 20. As I was thinking about this, I've been trying to figure out what my headline indicators would be if I were the czar, putting them in place, drawing in part on some work that Brian and others and Tony Atkinson did, I don't know, 20 years ago, maybe. Although that was really focused on inclusion. Anyway, I can think of quite a few that I would put ahead of income inequality or wealth inequality. A second implication here is that, so there's an American economist, Robert Shiller, who pointed out about 20 years ago, I think even earlier in a book that he wrote, we could actually, if we thought income inequality was important enough that we really needed to reduce it or get it to a low level, we could do this fairly simply. There's a simple technical fix, which is that you can create an algorithm that adjusts tax rates. And if the Gini coefficient or the top 1% share goes up, maybe it's the last 2, 3, 5 years, tax rates just adjust to bring it back down to the desired level. I don't think we should do this. There are also now arguments for maximum income or wealth levels. I think there are two really good, interesting books, one by Tom Mallison and another by Ingrid Robbins. I didn't pronounce her last name. And there probably are others. These are both very recent. Worth reading. I don't think this is a good idea either. I think it's likely to get in the way with our efforts to understand how to most effectively draw as much income as possible from much tax revenue as possible from those at the top in order to fund those services and goods and transfers that are key to raising the floor. We could significantly reduce income inequality by substituting for various public services and maybe goods a universal basic income. There's a very vibrant debate going on now about whether we should add a UBI or something like a UBI, but we could sidestep the constraint that this is very expensive and the money would have to be coming from somewhere by just saying, okay, we care so much about reducing income inequality that let's just swap this out for services and thereby will help improve democracy or economic growth or life expectancy or happiness or whatever. Not a good idea, I don't think. I can elaborate if you want. And then this is slightly complicated unless you're immersed in literature on proportional taxes and equal payment benefits, whether they're services or goods or transfers. But there are circumstances when policymakers face a choice between improving or offering some sort of new service or public good, but where they don't have the leverage or the coalition, or it's not the right moment to get that money from those at the top or near the top of the distribution. And so the only way to get it is to tax everybody. I think they should do it, even if it doesn't have any impact on income or wealth inequality. I mean, obviously, each decision is a one-off and should be made based on the particular circumstances. But as a general principle, I'm not in favor of not doing something that's going to improve a lot of people's lives just because it doesn't also reduce income inequality or wealth inequality for that matter. And then lastly, and this comes back to the measure of global inequality, there's a literature that disagrees a good bit about this, but there are a number of policymakers who I think believe that extensive imports from low-income countries and extensive migration from low-income or middle-income countries are bad for wages and therefore bad for income equality in their country. And so we can, one way to reduce inequality is by limiting imports or limiting immigration. I'm not in favor of doing that. I don't think that should be the first choice. This too, these are complicated matters and a lot of it has to do with electoral politics. But as a general principle, again, my own view is that we want to think more broadly here about global inequality and not only focus on inequality within particular countries. So I also have some suggestions about how, again, if our policies are, we could reduce inequality, which again, I'll say I favor doing, just that it shouldn't be a top priority. But I'm going to leave it there and happy to come back to any of this if you want me to.